Hello, I'm Rick Anthony, and this is CaregiveraAssist, a new monthly series of special programs of, by, and for family caregivers, the brigade of 53 million unpaid family caregivers in this country who have the daunting responsibility of safeguarding the well-being of care-dependent adults. That's 1 in 5 Americans caring for an older adult or a person with disabilities. Chances are you are or will be a full-time or part-time caregiver sometime in your lifetime. So listen up. This series was inspired by my own recent experience as a primary caregiver for my late wife, who died after a long illness. When she died, I made a pledge that I would try to be helpful to other caregivers whose lives change suddenly when caregiving takes priority over virtually everything else. In each monthly episode, we'll have experts in the field to talk about the myriad aspects of caregiving, as well as some caregivers who will join us to share their journeys. We'll also answer some of the most commonly asked questions about caregiving. You're invited to submit questions if you wish, and we'll try to answer them on the show. To kick off the first episode of Caregiver Assist here at MLTV 21, I'm joined by my friend Barry Jacobs, who has a doctorate in clinical psychology, is a family therapist, and a member of AARP's Caregiver Advisory Panel. He's written or co-written dozens of articles and several books on caregiving, and served as caregiver for his mother and stepfather, both of whom had dementia, so he's a veteran caregiver. Barry, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Rick, and thank you. Sorry for your loss.
Thank you. It's been a horrible experience. It's only about 7 weeks since God took her.
I feel for you. This is a very recent loss. I know it was a very grievous loss.
And everybody talks about the grief process, and apparently there's some kind of a timeline and so on. But as you know better than I, grieving is a very personal thing, and there's no time clock. There's no schedule for it. It is what it is.
It is. There's no recipe. Everyone does this differently. We know that particularly losing a spouse is we're thinking about months and years. We're not talking about days and weeks.
Yeah. I joined a bereavement group, and hearing some of the other stories, it doesn't make me feel better, but I mean, some of the other stories are worse than mine in terms of the pain and suffering that the loved one went through before they passed. And then the wreckage that was left afterwards. I'm losing my voice. As an author for AARP, you've covered a number of subjects. I was looking over the list, and most of them, not most of them, all of them are relevant to what we're trying to do here, and we will cover many subjects similar to what you've written about over this series. The list, though, is interesting. I thought I selected only a few that our viewers might be interested in seeing. The one that stands out for me because of my personal experience, family caregivers wonder, what is my loved one with dementia feeling? I often wondered what was going through my wife's mind. She was aware to some extent, but she has some of the other manifestations of early stage dementia. What do they feel?
I think people with dementia, to make some broad generalizations, feel different things at different times. I mean, when someone gets the diagnosis of dementia, they are often extremely distraught and worried and concerned about being a burden to their families. Sometimes people can't handle the initial diagnosis and may deny it, may try to prove that they are more capable. And oftentimes when people are in the early stages of dementia, they are quite capable. They could do quite a number of things, including driving, making decisions. I think later on in dementia, when people don't have the same cognitive abilities that they had before, then the mind is a kind of cipher. It's very hard to figure out when someone's just sitting there still, not saying anything, not initiating any activity. It's very hard to read their mind.
I asked a doctor one time, isn't there some medication that can slow the process? And it's an interesting response. He said, yes, there is, but why would you want to? Why not let it follow its natural course so that she gets to the point where she's simply not aware? and therefore in a better place, relatively in a better place. I guess that made sense.
I have heard people say that, but I've also heard people who want to live as high quality life as they can say, no, please give me the medicine like Aricept that has some capacity for slowing the progression, doesn't stop the progression.
Right. There is no cure.
There is no cure. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons why so many Americans are in this position of caring for loved ones. If we had a cure, believe me, there would be lines miles long for people wanting to get this cure.
Well, let's step back for a minute. I mentioned at the opening, 53 million, and I think that number used to be not too long ago, 43 million.
In 2015, it was 43 million. So in a fairly short time between 2015 and actually 2020 was when the last survey was done. It's jumped up, and it's jumped up primarily because the American population is aging, and so more people are developing dementia, which means more family members are having to step up and care for them.
I've also heard that we're on the brink of a caregiving crisis in this country, and other countries as well, I'm sure, because of the aging population. Is that because there are fewer people willing and able to be caregivers, unpaid caregivers?
So there's something known as the care gap, which is yet coming. So right now, we have a lot of baby boomers in their 60s and 70s who still can care for spouses, still care for parents that are in their 90s. And the ratio of caregivers to people who need care is 4 to 1. As the baby boomers themselves, this gigantic generation ages, the ratio is going to go to 7 to 1, which means we're going to just have fewer people who are available to do this care. Actually, you know what? Let me reverse that. Because I said that wrong. We have far more people now available to do the care than we're going to have within families in the future. We also have workforce shortages of every sort in this country right now with our economy, but certainly in what's called the care economy. So that means we have fewer home health aides, we have fewer therapists, fewer doctors. And that means that people who need care, families who need care, are having trouble getting that care.
Mm-hmm. The stereotypical image of a caregiver has been a middle-aged woman who's taking care of her parents, mother or father. Is that still the case? That's
still the most common type of caregiver. We call that the sandwich generation caregiver. Oftentimes there's someone who's caring for a parent, maybe having some child care responsibilities for either children or grandchildren, and they're getting squeezed in the middle, and that's why we call them the sandwich generation. But within the last 25, 30 years, more men are caregivers. The ratio between men and women caregivers now is around 60-40, women to men. Years ago, it was 70-30, so us men are stepping up. And I think the other thing is that it's not just adult children or spouses that are doing this work, more great-grandchildren are doing this. So more people in their 20s and 30s are caring for people within their family who need care.
Yeah. What effect has COVID had on caregiving? I've heard that it's finally brought caregiving to the forefront.
I think what's happened is that particularly during the worst of the pandemic, more people were confined to home with people that needed care. So that means they were not using the typical services that were supporting those folks. So they were not bringing home health aides into the home for fear of bringing infection into the home. They were not using adult day programs. So that means more family members were on the front line providing the care on a 24/7 basis. And that created tremendous stress. It was one of the major stressors that families went through during the worst of the pandemic. And it did bring to awareness within the American public that this is a problem. Our population is aging. More people need to care for parents or spouses who are ill, or for children. And we don't have the infrastructure within this country currently to provide for the needs. And the likelihood is it's only going to get worse as our population continues to age.
And yet I don't recall ever hearing a politician or a policymaker mention caregiving and the need to address caregiving because of the aging population and because of the support systems that have to be in place. I don't recall ever hearing any of them talk about caregiving.
I think it's beginning, and it's beginning because we have so many constituents who want support. And the federal government just put out, actually the Administration for Community Living within the federal government just put out what's called a National Strategy for Family Caregivers. It's a piece of, it's a compendium of ideas that states can implement, that different agencies can implement, and individuals can implement. It's many years in the making, but specifically the last 3-4 years. And this is the first time the federal government has put out such a document as this, and it's really going to guide a lot of efforts on the state and local.
What's your opinion of it?
I think it's excellent. I mean, it really is a distillation of some of the research and some of the work to identify what's successful, what caregivers really need, and so this is going to be the guide for a lot of the efforts to support caregivers.
It's available to anyone?
It's under 2022 National Strategy for Family Caregivers. It's it's actually 3 different documents, but it has a tremendous number of ideas. And really demonstrates that as a society, we are becoming more aware of this, and we're beginning to take concrete action.
Would you agree that in most cases, caregiving is thrust upon an individual? It comes out of nowhere, that there's little or no time to prepare, and so there's a shock factor that all of a sudden my life isn't my own.
I think it varies with the illness. So something like dementia is a slowly progressing illness. The diagnosis is a shock. No one likes to think of a loved one as being on that path where they're going to decline. But because it's generally slowly progressing, it doesn't have an immediate impact oftentimes on the caregiver. They may take on a few more responsibilities for the person who's been diagnosed, but it doesn't greatly alter the caregiver's life. But there are other illnesses, like someone has a stroke and suddenly they are completely incapacitated, or they have a severe heart attack, and that those more sudden and devastating impacts will then turn the caregiver's life upside down on a dime.
But even in early stage dementia, there can be situations. Well, one of the physicians said she can't be left alone.
I mean,
she's at risk of hurting herself or doing some damage to somebody else.
I mean, that's possible. What typically happens is, and this happened in the case with my mom who had dementia, is we find that someone who's been independent, caring for themselves and managing their affairs on their own for many years, suddenly they can't manage their affairs.
Yeah.
My mother, suddenly I became aware that she had mismanaged her money, and I literally had to step in and take over her finances and actually get a bankruptcy attorney for her because she had mismanaged them so badly. And it was only then, when that sort of crisis occurs, that it suddenly becomes fully apparent that someone is having dementia. Another example is someone who, an adult child finds out that their parent who lives in Florida, that their electricity was turned off. How did that happen? Well, because the electric company will tell you that that parent didn't pay their bill for 6 months. And then why didn't they pay their bill for 6 months? Because that parent is having cognitive issues. That's the sudden shock that really lets the caregiver know that life is going to be different going forward.
Are you aware of many resources to train, instruct, orient caregivers?
I mean, there's quite a lot online now, and there are some major advocacy organizations that do excellent work in helping prepare caregivers. AARP is one, Caregiver Action Network is another, Family Caregiver Alliance is the third. There are others, but those are websites that provide direction, that provide education, provide specific guidance for many of the situations that caregivers face, as well as the skills that they have to acquire to do a good job.
I recently learned that Surrey Services, with which you're familiar, has started a Caregiver Academy. It's a training program.
Yes, so there are many local agencies. Surrey Services is one. I am on the board of the Senior Community Services in Delaware County that runs that county's family caregiver support program. It too has a Caregiver Academy. What Caregiver Academies typically are education series to teach caregivers some basic skills. what often ends up happening is people get into caregiving and believe that their experience is unique somehow. They don't realize that so many Americans, as you pointed out, are going through this. Many of their experiences are common.
Yes.
There's certain information that's helpful to all of them. And so they become aware of what they're doing and what they need to learn. But they also become aware that the feelings that they're having are normal. Because sometimes people, when they are feeling tired or maybe even resentful for all their caregiving duties, feel guilty, then they find out those are normal feelings. Most people feel them to a degree.
Mm-hmm. Is there a path? You mentioned resentment, anger, and so on. Is there a sequence that a first-time caregiver can expect to go through? And maybe it is at first anger, resentment, finally acceptance, and then, you know what I'm saying? Sure.
What I would say is the path would probably be initially a little bit of denial, that no, my caregiver, my loved one doesn't need that much help. They're fine. You know, the doctor may say that they need more help, but I'm not seeing it yet. And then it finally becomes apparent, yes, they do need the help. And then sometimes people are resentful. Oftentimes they're gung ho. They want to say, all right, this is my duty. I'm going to do this. This is an important duty for me to fulfill as a good spouse, as a good adult child. Mm-hmm. It's only later when people are really worn down by their caregiving duties, and that sometimes could take years, or they've sacrificed so much of their other pursuits, friendships, social activities, that the resentment begins to come in. And then what adds to the resentment is when the person that they're caring for is not grateful, which sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're very unhappy because they're on the receiving end of care. They can't help themselves. Well, sometimes they can't, but that doesn't mean that the caregiver doesn't have feelings about a care receiver who's angry at them. Or other family members don't seem to appreciate the sacrifices that the caregiver is making, and the caregiver is very resentful of other family members that aren't stepping up and are not themselves thankful for what this caregiver is doing.
Mm-hmm. As you know, I was involved in a project where we were putting together a program for employee caregivers, for employers to provide some support and assistance. And I came to understand, I'm not sure I understood, anyway, to appreciate how difficult it is to try to maintain a job, full-time job, where you're trying to develop a career path, all your energy is in that direction. Then all of a sudden, you've got an overriding responsibility back home. How do you do those two things?
With great difficulty and a lot of juggling. I mean, I'll give you an example. I worked for many years as a psychologist working in a primary care office, which happened to be literally a mile from the apartment where my mother and stepfather, both of whom had dementia, were living. It would not be unusual for me to get a call in the middle of my workday from my mother saying, that my stepfather had fallen. Mm-hmm. She would rather not call the fire department for the umpteenth time to pick him up. And she wasn't strong enough to pick him up. So could I run over from work and pick him up? So if I had the flexibility in my schedule, and fortunately I was in a position where I usually did, I left my job, went over to my mother's apartment, picked him up, make sure he wasn't hurt, and then ran back to work. Yeah. And then, that was very disruptive. I mean, I was glad to live close enough to do that, but it was highly disruptive to what my work activities were.
But you had an expectation in the back of your mind that there could be a call today.
I was always waiting for the call.
Sure.
You get to that point where when the phone rings, your heart jumps a little bit.
Yeah. Is caregiving different in other countries? Japan, years ago anyway, used to be commended for the care it took of its older population. I'm not sure that's as true today because their population is aging very quickly. Same with the other Asian countries. And some European countries, I think, are reportedly do a better job of taking care of their older folk.
One of the things that European countries like Sweden and England do is they pay a stipend to family members who are in the caregiving role, which happens to a very small degree in this country, but there's a much more generous stipend in Sweden and England. Japan is very interesting because we have about 17% of Americans are over the age of 65, In Japan, and right now it's about 30%, and it's going up to 40% at some point. And what Japan did in the year 2000 is they passed a law basically saying that, just the same way that people have to pay into Social Security, they have to also pay into a fund that will provide them with hands-on support, for when they age. And so most Japanese have this government resource to draw upon to pay for home health aides, adult daycare, insure, diapers, all the things that they might need. So it's not as much of a hardship to Japanese families. So in that way, Japanese culture has done an exceptional job as a society in supporting older family members.
Yes, excuse me, but that is a substitute for what used to be the case, that is the family would take care of the older generation.
I was in Japan giving some caregiver talks about 5 years ago, and we talked a lot about this. And there were, I was in Tokyo and giving talks at Tokai University, and there were many folks I spoke with there who lived and had careers in Tokyo, but had originally come from small rural villages. Their parents still lived in their small rural village. They were able to maintain their careers in Tokyo because they knew back in the small rural village there was this infrastructure of support that the government was funding through funds that had come out of people's paychecks over a long period of time.
What's your assessment of what we do in this country to support caregivers? I'm not even going to talk about the older population, but just the caregivers, for the 53 million and going up. Again, from a policy standpoint, regulation, whatever. You know it all, you've seen it all, and I'm sure you've maybe even given testimony. How are we doing?
I think we're doing better. So when I started working years ago at Bryn Mawr Rehab, and I worked with folks families and individuals dealing with very significant disabilities, there wasn't even a term family caregiver. So there's a lot of branding that's occurred and a lot of services that have been created since then. It's been a kind of slow increase in services over time. Are we where we need to be now? No. Caregivers need more support, but we are far better. We have a much better caregiver support infrastructure in place in every community through area agencies on aging, through nonprofit agencies like Surrey Services, through churches. We're across the street from Wayne Presbyterian Church, and I've given a number of talks over the years there about supporting family caregivers. So there are churches that have caregiver missions or senior missions that support caregivers. So there's greater public awareness, there's greater public and private resources that are going to supporting caregivers, because there's a recognition that more of us are going through this and more of us need help. That's great, we need more.
Given the fact that we don't have as many caregivers as we need and will not in the foreseeable future, what impact is technology having on caregiving? Will there be robots that take care of people with dementia?
There certainly are robots in Japan, especially in nursing facilities, where it's not unusual for people who live in nursing facilities who have dementia to have a robot doll that provides comfort to them. I mean, that's very common. Some of that is received publicity in this country, but it's not widespread. It's not implemented very much. What's much more common now, and we're going to see a lot more of, is what's called remote monitoring. Yes. So we have within homes ways of detecting whether someone got up in the morning, whether they're moving around the house, or health, some of their health status.
Barry, I was amazed at what's available. A match you put on the bed so you know when they get out of bed, either under the bed or on the floor. Other technology that I became aware of and bought some of it. But it had mostly to do with monitoring, surveillance.
Correct.
Little to do with actually helping or relieving the caregiver of any of the responsibility. And I don't know what that, can a robot feed? Can a robot change? Can a robot do any of the things that have personal care? I don't think so.
Not to my knowledge at this point. And And so the robots, there's like a robot cat that's very popular in Japan. That's primarily to provide comfort to the person with dementia, almost the way a real life cat might provide comfort.
We have those here as well.
Yes, we do.
I've seen them advertised.
Yeah. But are we going to have robots getting people out of bed, dressing them, serving them? I'm sure there are folks that are working on that. I haven't seen those products as yet.
What was the most difficult part of your personal experience as a caregiver?
I would basically say being very hard on myself. As much as I tried to do for my mother and stepfather, I was also a worker, a husband, a father to teenage children at that time. I was spread really thin, and I always felt that I was shortchanging not just my mother and stepfather, I was shortchanging my wife, I was shortchanging my kids. I couldn't do enough for anyone. I felt like I was failing in all my family roles and my work roles. It was a very bad feeling, and so because I was beating myself up a little bit, it made caregiving infinitely harder, unfortunately.
So what did you do?
Well, what I did is I listened to my wife. And I'm not joking.
Always a good idea.
Yeah, my wife sat me down and basically said, what you're trying to do is unrealistic. We need to get more help in the home for my mother and stepfather. You have to carve out time for the kids and for your mother and stepfather, but not over function for either of them. And I took her advice, and it worked. And we did get lots more hired help for my mother and stepfather. And that originally I felt guilty about bringing hired help, like a lot of caregivers do. It's like, it's my job, right? I'm supposed to do this.
Yes.
But the fact is, it was my job to make sure they were well cared for. It wasn't my job to actually do the care myself entirely.
Were they living independently, or were they in a facility?
So originally, we moved them up from Florida because my stepfather had very bad dementia at that time, and my mother was just beginning to develop dementia. We moved them into an apartment a mile from our house. My wife and I were over there multiple times a week. Sure. We also had them over at our house several days a week for dinner. We kept a very close eye on them. So that, after a while, became very stressful for us. So we had to figure out what could we do for them while they're in the apartment, but also what was too much for us without disrupting our family life. Later on, both of them went into facilities, and then there was a lot more support there in the facility because the facility provides that support. But then it was a matter of driving and making sure the help in the facility was doing the job, which sometimes I was very happy with the facilities. Other times I was unhappy. They're both very stressful situations. I
have a good friend, who's an absolutely beautiful wife. All of a sudden, something happened, and she was in rapid decline. I mean, she was articulate, she could write, she was beautifully dressed, she could cook, she could do everything. And all of a sudden, everything shut down because her mother had passed away, I think, and she had a really traumatic reaction to it. At any rate, he swore he would never put her in a facility. He said, I want to take care of her at home. They had one other child. They had one child. And I was surprised a couple of years later. He told me that he had come to the conclusion that it was in her best interest to put her in a facility. It's a tough decision.
It's a very tough decision. I will tell you that that's a fairly common story. I think many people promise to themselves or promise to the person who's receiving care that they will always stay at home. But as with your friend, it gets to a place where the most loving and safe thing to do is to have someone in a facility, because caregivers can't provide the 24/7 help that a loved one may need, and having them in a facility will provide that support for them.
It must be a difficult adjustment when you've been a caregiver for some time and your loved one passes, and now it's kind of empty, not just because you've lost a loved one, but your routine is all of a sudden changed. You have an empty dance card, not much to do.
This too, unfortunately, is very common, and many people who've been in that caregiver role, especially for years, struggle with that adjustment, and that adjustment
Yeah.
makes the grieving process harder because it's not just, as you point out, it's not just the loss of the person, but the loss of what has been
Yes.
an all-consuming role, and oftentimes it can be a very gratifying role.
I've got a lot more questions to ask, so I hope you'll come back.
I'd love to come back, and this is a very important topic. I thank you for
No,
having this show, Rick.
I thank you, and again, I'm looking forward to doing this every month and bringing in people like you who can share experience and give some guidance to people who are. I was lost. I didn't know what I was really getting into, or if I was doing a good job.
That you're describing what 95% of caregivers experience.
Well, it's been a pleasure having you here, and I again appreciate your helping me kick off this program. And again, I hope you'll come back. There's so much to cover. How can people learn about your private practice and the books that you have written?
My wife and I have written several books together. We have a website that's www.loveandmeaning.com, love and meaning all one word.com. And I have a private psychotherapy practice in Media in Delaware County. Okay. And I do see quite a number of family caregivers in that practice.
Okay. Those of you who are tuning in, and if you have questions about caregiving, we'd be happy to try to address them and be of help to you. The number is on the screen, the email address, I should say, so that you can direct those questions, and we'll read them and do our best to be responsive. Until next time, this is Caregiver Assist. I am Rick Anthony. Love you, Marlene.